Every day, Georgetown students walk past White-Gravenor Hall without thinking about the history behind it. As one of the university's central academic buildings, White-Gravenor represents Georgetown's Jesuit identity, a tradition rooted in faith, education, and moral leadership. But behind that image is a more troubling history. Georgetown's growth was tied to Jesuit plantations and enslaved labor, including the 1838 sale of 272 enslaved men, women, and children by Jesuit leaders connected to the university. The existence of White-Gravenor reveals the contradiction between Georgetown's religious values and its reliance on slavery, a legacy that still shapes the campus today. To understand the contradiction behind White-Gravenor, we have to go back to the earliest Jesuits in Maryland. One of the most important was Father Andrew White, a Jesuit priest who arrived in Maryland in 1634 with the first English Catholic settlers. In his account, A Brief Relation of the Voyage into Maryland, White describes the Jesuits' early mission as religious and moral. He writes about encountering indigenous communities, especially the Piscataway, and presents the Jesuits as people bringing Christianity and civil life to the region. White's language throughout the account reflects the larger colonial mindset of the period. He frequently describes indigenous communities through a European Christian perspective, emphasizing conversation and cultural exchange as part of the Jesuit mission. In presenting indigenous people as populations to be guided, educated, and transformed, the text reveals how religious authority and colonial power were closely connected from the beginning of Maryland's history. This is important to understanding Georgetown's later relationship with slavery because it shows that Jesuit institutions were not only religious organizations, but also participants in systems that sought to control land, labor, and marginalized communities. Further, White's account shows how Jesuits saw themselves as spiritual guides to indigenous people, positioning their mission as benevolent and morally righteous. Later, the same Jesuit institution that claimed this religious purpose would also become deeply involved in plantation slavery. So from the beginning, Georgetown's Jesuit history was shaped by a tension between religious mission and systems of power. But the history of the Jesuits in Maryland also included plantation ownership. One important site was St. Indigo's, a Jesuit plantation in southern Maryland. Records from the Georgetown Slavery Archive show that enslaved people were treated not only as laborers, but as taxable property. The statue of St. Ignatius points back to the origins of the Jesuits themselves, a religious order founded around discipline, education, and service. At Georgetown, this Jesuit identity is still central to how the university presents itself. In an 1836 tax document, Father Joseph Carberry, the Jesuit manager at St. Indigo's, asked the St. Mary's County Levy Court to remove enslaved people from his tax burden after they had been sold or otherwise removed from the plantation. 6 of those sold were children under the age of 8. This tax deduction document shows how slavery was embedded within Jesuit institutions in Maryland, revealing the tension between Georgetown's religious identity and its continued commemoration of figures connected to slavery. This contradiction became most visible in 1838, when Georgetown's Jesuit leadership approved the sale of 272 enslaved men, women, and children from the Maryland's Jesuit plantations. The Articles of Agreement were signed by Father Thomas Mouldy, then the president of Georgetown's College, with Henry Johnson and Jesse Beatty, 2 buyers from Louisiana. The document identifies the enslaved people by name and sets out the terms of the sale, reducing entire families to property within a financial contract. This was not a distant or accidental connection to slavery. It was an institutional decision made by Jesuit leaders to protect their financial interests. The sale helped address the debts of the Maryland Jesuits in Georgetown, but it came at the cost of separating families and sending many people from Maryland to plantations in Louisiana. In this document, the moral language of religion disappears. What remains is the legal and economic language of ownership, sale, and debt. White-Gravenor is more than just a campus building. It represents the Jesuit institution that shaped Georgetown's history and identity. Archival records show that Jesuit leaders were already discussing the sale of enslaved people even before the 1838 agreement was finalized. In an 1837 letter preserved in the Georgetown Slavery Archive, Father William McSherry wrote to Father Rothon about the proposed sale, revealing that the decision was debated within Jesuit leadership rather than made suddenly or accidentally. This history complicates Georgetown's modern identity as a Jesuit institution grounded in faith, service, and justice. The same leadership that promoted these religious values also participated in slavery and treated enslaved people as financial assets tied to the survival of the institution. White-Gravenor therefore stands as a symbol of Georgetown's central contradiction, a university founded on religious and moral ideals, yet shaped by systems of exploitation and enslaved labor. Rachel Swarn's The 272 helps reconstruct the human history behind documents like the 1838 Articles of Agreement. Instead of treating the sale as only an institutional event, Swarns follows the families who were enslaved, sold, separated, and remembered by their descendants. Today, Georgetown has taken steps to confront this history. The university renamed buildings for Isaac Hawkins and Anne Marie Beecraft, created resources like the Georgetown Slavery Archive, and recognizes descendants of the GU 272 through admissions consideration. Georgetown and Jesuit leaders have also been involved in the Descendants, Truth, and Reconciliation Foundation, which supports scholarships, racial healing, and descendant communities. But these efforts do not erase the past. In fact, they show how present this history still is. White-Gravenor reminds us that Georgetown's legacy of slavery is not separate from the campus. It remains embedded in the institution's building, memory, and identity.